Rockin' Royal, rockin' Navy, know y'all with me, let's get it, baby, Rockin' Royal, rockin' Navy,
Welcome back to another edition of the Rockin' Royal Soccer Podcast, postseason edition and year-ending edition. Fortunately or unfortunately, probably depending on how you look at it, maybe a little bit of both, but mostly unfortunately, coming off of BYU's 1-0 loss to Santa Clara in the opening round of the NCAA Tournament. Sean Walker from KSL.com, joined as always by my illustrious co-host Carla Swensen-Haslem. You know her from ESPN Plus, BYU TV, and the former BYU women's soccer star. And Carla, BYU season is over. Santa Clara moves on in the NCAA tournament. BYU goes home. And I got to admit, I'm not terribly disappointed by this. Well, we'll get into the game a little bit. We'll get into the overall result. I think there are things to be upset with, but also some things to be pretty happy about. And to be totally honest, Carla, this is a point in the season where I'm not sure a lot of BYU fans and maybe even a handful of players, certainly few people outside of that locker room at the very least, maybe expected the season to end at this point. And so I'm struggling to feel like this is too much of a disappointing end to the season. But first, before we get into that, how are you doing after a disappointing end of the season?
Well, I'm kind of with you, Sean. I'm actually feeling pretty optimistic about how this season went. We've mentioned before how we did not know what to expect from this BYU team. We didn't even know if they were going to make the tournament. We didn't know if they were going to lose half of their conference games. And so the fact that they made it to the tournament and got a home bid, like that's no small thing. The fact that they got a home bid, ended the season, at least the regular season ranked, did very well in conference play, lost in the semifinals. I think this team actually did really well considering that it was a building year, considering that most of the team was a freshman team. So I actually don't feel that sort of disappointment that sometimes you feel, at the end of when you're done with the NCAA tournament, because I feel like this BYU team really did exceed expectations. And that's something we can talk about a little bit more in the podcast, but I think it's a team that really exceeded expectations, played well, dealt with a lot of challenges this year, primarily of injuries. It felt like every other player was injured, and they were able to really bounce back from that. And they lost to Santa Clara. Like, there's no shame in losing to the Broncos. Santa Clara is one of those legacied, heralded soccer programs. They haven't won a national championship in a couple of years, but like they have a bunch to their name. They always have players that play for the U.S. women's national team. So, like, losing 1-0 to Santa Clara, it's unfortunate that they had to meet in the first round, and I have a lot of thoughts on that we can get to as far as like how the NCAA seeded them. But I digress. The point I'm making is there's no shame in losing to Santa Clara, and there is no shame in making it to the NCAA tournament when you are very much in a building year and most of your team are freshmen.
Yeah, this is a really good Santa Clara team. 12-3-4 during the regular season, 6-1-3 in West Coast Conference play. BYU knows a thing or two about that league. Winning the WCC is no joke. It's a very good conference. Santa Clara is a very good program. So good, in fact, that this team was actually ranked number 11 in the country in the final United Soccer Coaches National Poll. So the 11th ranked team has to go on the road to Provo, Utah, to a former conference rival, a place where they have a lot of history, two coaches who know each other extremely well. They've both been on the job for 30 plus years in both of their cases, and they play out a very close game. Tori Powell gets the game winner, the only goal of the match, in the 70th minute. On a little bit of a counter, a shot from outside of the box, a little bit against the run of play. And I don't say that in a way to knock Santa Clara at all. It's just they had an opportunity. They took an opportunity. They converted an opportunity. It was Santa Clara's only shot on goal of the second half.
Yeah.
And it just pings the back of the net. There's not a whole lot that I think Lynette Hernandez could do against that shot as well. It was just very well taken from just outside of the 18, lost the ball over the defense, dips it underneath the crossbar into the upper 90. Really just a very tough ball to defend. in general. You can maybe make an argument for a defender stepping up and meeting her. But also when you're talking about being 25 yards from goal, Carla, you know as well as anybody, sometimes you kind of give up shots like that if you feel like you need to compact and tighten the defense a little bit, because those are a little bit one in a million. So again,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I agree with you. I think it was wise on BYU's part to put players back and keep Santa Clara from getting inside the box. I would rather let Santa Clara shoot from distance and get a good, shot that isn't I don't want to say lucky shot because it was well placed, but you would rather take your chances with a long distance shot than let them get into the box. And so they were probably playing to those numbers and taking a bit of a risk, and I don't blame BYU for that. And BYU did have opportunities. It's not like Santa Clara was outplaying them. That was one of my probably only frustration with this NCAA seeding is I don't think these teams should have met this early. They probably should have met at least in the second round. But usually those first round wins, for the home side are usually pretty one-sided. But the fact that the NCAA put two really good teams in the first round, I think, is really tough. It's difficult because they had to give Utah State the opportunity to host at home because they had such a great season. But that being said, these two teams probably shouldn't have met as early as they did.
Yeah, and I think regionalization is to blame. We've talked about it on the show before. We've talked about it off of the show before. We've talked about it on multiple shows. It's a topic of conversation around this time of year. Regionalization of the NCAA tournament, Carla, in my opinion, quite frankly, is ruining that first round in a lot of ways, because you're right. These two teams shouldn't have been playing each other in round one. There should have been other options. There should have been other. I mean, I don't feel like saving a few bucks on short flights or less flights is really worth this kind of a result for either way. Because Santa Clara probably should have won this game. Again, they're the number 11 ranked team in
They
the
probably
country.
should have had a home game.
Yeah,
They probably should. Their first round should have been at home too against, perhaps a lower seeded or weaker team or non-seeded team. I mean.
Yeah, but because of NCAA tournament regionalization and not wanting to move away from the West Coast or West area with teams in the West, Santa Clara instead has to go to Provo. BYU is the victim right there. There were also some bracketing principles that had to be followed. You mentioned Utah State. BYU and Utah State obviously met each other at Southfield. Aggies won earlier in the year, and so the selection committee does prefer to prevent regular season rematches. So that obviously wasn't going to be much of an option. Utah State instead hosts Washington, falls in a penalty kick shootout 3-1 up there in Logan in their first ever home NCAA tournament game. BYU also gets the host, but against a program that they know a lot better, and yet also against a program that probably shouldn't have been traveling. And I got to imagine, head coach Jerry Smith never admitted to this. Very classy individual, as he's been over the years when coming to Provo. He was very complimentary of Jen Rockwood and the BYU program. He never once complained about having to travel to the NCAA tournament, but he did say that one of the places they did not want to go was BYU. He knew it was a possibility because of our PI, because of where they play in the WCC and everything. He knew it was a possibility that they might travel, but they didn't want to have to travel to Provo, and so it was there was a decent amount of disappointment when the bracket was revealed between BYU and Santa Clara, and it proved out, like you said, to be a very close game. BYU edges Santa Clara 15-13 in overall shots. Again, just one shot on target in that second half by the Broncos. Santa Clara did a slightly better job putting their shots on target, if you will. They're about 4 to 4 apiece, excuse me. And a couple of phenomenal saves by the goalkeeper, and that's how you get a Bronco shutout in this one. So I think there's a lot to build on, though, Carla, and that's where I want to sort of rotate to next. That's where I think, quite honestly, the most important thing is for this BYU program, because this is a team that only graduated 3 seniors. They only celebrated 3 seniors on senior night. And I know in this age of the transfer portal, and we can talk about NIL if we want to even kind of lump that. I know those get lumped in together, but with player movement, there is a likely reduction in the roster size that should be coming down the pipe, depending on the House settlement, the settlement of the NCAA House v NCAA lawsuit that is probably coming through, that will likely affect how big teams are and how this team looks overall. So there are probably going to be some changes coming to this BYU team. And yet the changes, I feel like, probably should be minimal. In theory, they could return every one of their starting players by the end of from the end of the season for next year. What kind of a building block do you think this team is as BYU wraps up its season 9-7-5 overall with that first round NCAA tournament loss?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the big question now for this team as they take their rests and they start back up in January, start back to training and preparing for their spring season. I know it's considered unofficial training, but you get back to it January 1st. You're hitting the weight room and getting back to training with the team. Um, and so I do see almost all, if not all of those players returning, and perhaps in those starting positions, simply because they were so young and they did so well. And so I think BYU, if you're a BYU fan, if you're the BYU staff, now you're actually in a really good place because you have these players with immense experience that are still so young. And so I think for BYU, the biggest thing will still be building their offense. How did they make their offense more potent? We saw that offense start to get better as the season progressed and they started to score more goals. But I think that's the biggest question for BYU now is how do they use their spring play to score a bunch of goals? You know, they're most likely in the spring going to be playing against local teams. They're going to be playing UVU, Westminster, SUU. You know, those are talented teams, but BYU's goals should now be how do we score as many goals as possible against them. There will be some incoming high school players that have since graduated or graduating early. How do we help assimilate them into the program? I think that was one of the big advantages that BYU had for this young freshman team is that a good portion of them came and started playing in the spring season. And that always helps to be able to get those games under your belt. And so I think for BYU, that's the main issue now is how do we continue to build a potent attack and how do we assimilate these new freshmen, true freshmen that we're going to be graduating from high school this year? How do we assimilate them so that they can step right in like a Lucy Kessler, right? She's a perfect example of someone who graduated early, played in the spring, and then from there was able to get a lot of good minutes in the fall. How do we do that with these same sort of high school players?
11 freshmen, 12 sophomores, 6 juniors, just 2 official seniors. Like we mentioned, they'll be losing 3 to graduation and injuries on this team. None of them started by the end of the year. One of them did start at the beginning of the year. That was Tara Warner. She was a captain, starting outside back, turned into a starting center back, who ended the year with a knee injury. So she'll be missed, certainly. But BYU also had some time to kind of rebound and put together a back line. And I thought the back line came together very well. So that should be an area that is a strength of this BYU program, like it is with Jen Rockwood's program most of the time. I think the most important addition, Carla, and we'll get out of here on this because I don't want to focus too much on individuals. We'll save that for another offseason show, maybe down the road. We're going to take some time off and then we'll come back at that a little bit as well. But BYU should be returning its other captain who didn't play a single minute this year. I'm talking, of course, about Ellie Walbrook, the American Fork product by way of UCLA. She transferred in last year, was second on the team in goals scored in leading that magical run to the College Cup semifinals. You may remember tore her ACL during the spring season. Turf Monster got her. She missed the entire year, but she is ready to come back. She's actually been cleared to do some limited training right now. She has been able to work out. She's been doing some running for a little while, and she is able to do some work, some ball work and basic skill work on the field right now. So she should be ready to go in time for this spring season to get a full spring underway and get ready for the fall. And I think this Ellie Walbrook return could be absolutely instrumental and vital for this BYU program as they look to add and build on what they did this past year, right?
Yeah, I think that was, I think that missing hole in the attack. And that's not to downplay any of the good work that Ali Fryer or Mackenzie Vance or Aaron Bailey did. But it would definitely have helped to have Ellie there to be able to just have a little bit more attacking oomph, to just add more to it, right? To add to the arsenal that is already there. And so I think that will make a big difference to be able to have her to come back. I think it helps that Mackenzie Vance has now kind of found her position. She was another transfer coming in, and to be able to have her find kind of her positioning, I think makes a big difference too. And so BYU will not have to go through some of the growing pains that they had to this season.
Yeah, and two players that played together at UCLA, and Mackenzie Vance and Ellie
Yes.
Walworth, they were so excited to play with each other when Mackenzie first transferred, and then literally like a week later, I don't know if it was quite that short, but it was pretty close to it. Ellie suffers that torn ACL, and I think you're right. It gave Mackenzie a full year to really work into the system, to find her role, to figure out where she was in this group, whether that was a withdrawn striker, a little bit more forward role, maybe an attacking midfield role. I think she can play all of those positions, and how she plays off of Ellie could be pretty instrumental in the 2025 season for this BYU program. In addition, by the way, you mentioned them, Allie Fryer, Aaron Bailey. Allie coming off of back-to-back 9-goal seasons, or 11-goal seasons, double-digit goal scorer for this team. I only expect that to go up as she heads into her senior campaign. Same with Aaron Bailey, same with a couple of other players, in addition to several freshmen and sophomores that got some vital experience. I'm thinking of players in particular like Lucy Kessler that you mentioned, Avery Frischineck, manning the back line, and others. So there are going to be some questions to be answered, other questions to be posed. There will be changes. I can just about guarantee that. There always are, even in years where it looks like you're only losing 3 players. I would be shocked if those 3 players were the only ones that changed off of this roster, quite frankly, because that's where college athletics is right now, and women's soccer is no joke. So it's no different. So there are a lot of new freshmen that are coming in, a lot of decisions and choices to be made. We'll keep an eye on it in the off season. But Carla, as we get out of here, just give me your overall thoughts on the season off of the pitch. This was our first year, weekly updates on the podcast feed here on Rock and Royal with this BYU women's soccer team. How was it? And on a scale of 1 to 11, how likely would you be to want to come back?
Well, I definitely want to come back. So 11 out of 11. But yeah, I think my overall thoughts again are just optimistic and positive, and I think this BYU team should feel optimistic and positive on how they ended things. They made a ton of progress. A lot of players really found themselves, and I think the team really found themselves amidst all the challenges and struggles that they had this year with losses and new players and injuries. The team's mentality was really good. They stayed very, the team inside the locker room and on the pitch stayed very positive and worked hard, and you give a lot of credit for such young players to be able to be so resilient. And so I count this as a win. Obviously BYU's gone all the way to the final championship before, and so some may be tempted to look at this first round loss as a disappointment, but given the circumstances of the season, I think this BYU team should be very happy and very proud with how they ended this season.
I agree. I totally agree. It was always going to be a little bit of a rebuild or a reload year. I think this team rebuilt very well and prepared itself for the next several, not just next year, but the next several years to come. So we'll wrap up. We'll put a bow on the 2024 season. Again, BYU women's soccer finishing the year with 9 wins, which again 9-7-5, I guess, after the NCAA tournament. First round loss to Santa Clara. We'll keep apprised on the offseason. Like I said, we're going to take a little bit of time off. I'm going to give Carla back to her husband and her beautiful daughter to spend some time there. But we'll be back sometime in the offseason. Maybe we'll reconvene during the spring to take a look at this team and look forward as we keep more tabs on BYU Women's Soccer here on the Rock and Royal Soccer Show. Good night, and thanks for all the fish.
Touchdown, Cougars, who they want now. Red is upstate, and we don't do no uptown. Had them singing like a flute. We don't play around with no oots. Or them Aggies up in Ogden, they not rocking how we rocking. Rockin' Navy, rockin' Royal, rock your hands. Rockabye babies, rock the stands with the fans. If you with us, raise your hands. Rockabye baby, rockin' Navy. Shout out to my teams, wives and babies. Rockin' Royal.